As always, I'm very late to the party to review these kinds of things because, as always, I don't really have the time to watch all the new stuff when they appear. The ending and generally the last season of the Man in the High Castle series has been heavily criticized and generally classified at least as subpar, if not outright bad. Well, I disagree. In fact, Season 4 provided more wisdom than the first 3 seasons combined, and while a 5th season would have definitely been in order, the ending was of Season 4, the ending was just really not bad at all. Let's explore. Hello everyone and welcome to the Freedom Alternative. Alright, so if you haven't seen The Man in the High Castle and you're one of those weirdos who complains about spoilers, then skip this video. So, The Man in the High Castle was for me one of those series that starts really slow. At about halfway into the 3rd season I was really ready to drop it. I mean, boring as fuck. But then the Null subplot was introduced, which was quite good, culminating with the ending of the 3rd season and Himmler's Null speech, which was very good. Finally, the writers got what they were missing, and what I was accusing them of when I recommended this show a few months ago, namely an expert in propaganda. Clearly, they retained the services of one for Season 3 and 4, as the propaganda aspect is much better polished than in the first half of the series. So, that is a good moment. Episode 10, Season 3, around the middle of the episode, when Himmler says, "This is your Führer's gift for you, a new beginning," and then screams Jahr Null, and then Ode of Joy starts being sung, you know, the anthem of the European Union. I mean, Himmler's speech in the show could have very well been Jean-Claude Juncker, so top tier setup for the crew that worked on the show. By comparison, Himmler's speech at the end of Season 2 is much weaker, which supports my theory that the show retained the services of a propaganda expert somewhere during the production of Season 3. Alright, but it's about Season 4 that I wanted to talk to you about. I just mentioned the Jahr Null speech because, in my opinion, it is the only portion that is not in Season 4, but is also full of wisdom. The wisdom that propaganda is amoral, and that most insane things imaginable can be thoroughly justified into popular support if one has the right propaganda. So I've compiled a list of 5 elements of wisdom that are very well portrayed in Season 4 of The Man in the High Castle, and I'll explain each one and then expect you all to disagree. So, number 1, office politics. The way the main character, John Smith, eventually ends up being in the position of a Reichsführer of a de facto independent National Socialist America is top-tier office politics wisdom. It is quite a shame that that thread is not explored even more deeply into the show, but enough of it is shown already. The way he cuts a deal with the other highly ambitious Obergruppenführer, Wilhelm Gertzmann, is in itself a scene that you can see in real life in any big organization, be it a corporation, a state institution, an intelligence agency, you name it. Sure, in our timeline we don't gas or stab our opponents, though literal stabbing sometimes does happen, but the process of a hostile takeover is remarkably similar. Drive the current power mad, exploit their weaknesses, and ally yourself with the most ambitious, power-hungry mofo you can find. And that's exactly what Smith does. He exploits Himmler's personality weaknesses, drives him insane, and basically pushes him into more or less, well, gassing himself, while at the same time letting the power-hungry ally, that would be Gertzmann, have a field day with the killing of the rest of the Nazi elite. Now, the plotting could not have worked otherwise. Gertzmann didn't have an easy entry to the Führer like Smith did, and Smith didn't have so many friends in Berlin to orchestrate the bloodbath in the war command room. So both had an incentive to work together for their mutual benefit. Believe it or not, this works in any organization, be it a dictatorship, a criminal enterprise, a corporation, an intelligence agency, or even a small blog or an NGO. Power struggles are a thing in any group larger than 3 people. And that's a piece of wisdom one should be able to relate to. Number 2, the importance of choice, freedom of choice, and trade-offs. The exploration of John Smith's past at the end of the war with the surrender and his early days in the Reich, as well as the exploration of John Smith from the alternative world when Juliana Crane questions him about his military career in that world, which is pre-civil rights America, also reveals a very important piece of wisdom. Namely that individuals are not inherently good or evil, it's a collection of choices that shape things. John Smith in the alternative world quit the military after the war because he was, quote, afraid of what the place was doing to him, unquote. And keep in mind that John Smith in that world would have been a hero, so he could have climbed up the ranks pretty fast and end up being somewhere in the top brass of the DoD. But he chose not to, because he didn't like what he was turning himself into as part of the higher echelons of the military. The trade-off was to be an insurance salesman, a position without any relevant social status. In return, though, he'd get to keep most of his friends and live a decent life. Now, John Smith, in the show's world, as we've seen in the flashbacks, also had the opportunity to quit the military after the war and seriously considered it for the exact same reasons. He didn't like what he was turning himself into already, and he thought of now being, and the thought of now being part of the enemy was scary in itself. On the other hand, not joining the Reich would have meant almost certain death of his son out of starvation. Also very likely a life on the run, as the officer recruiting him basically put it. In the flashback, some high-ranking officer just returning from the surrender ceremony of an American military base tells Smith and his wife, his friend Bill and the Jewish friend, "Those who join tomorrow will get food, shelter, good income and good positions in the Reich. Those who wait around will get nothing." Close quote. So the trade-off was also living a decent life, though it also meant losing his Jewish friend Danny, soon after taken to the camps and killed. So both Smiths made a choice for roughly the same reasons, but only one of them had the total freedom of choice. And then afterwards, Smith, as Obergruppenführer, still had the choice to stay in his lane, but as he himself knew it already, he couldn't help it from continuing to climb up the ranks. Both Smiths from both worlds knew and were aware of this personal flaw of them. They knew they were good at it, and they knew they wouldn't stop climbing the ranks despite of what the military would do to them as a person. This is a very profound piece of wisdom, impeccably illustrated in the show, in my opinions, and it applies to most things, to most people, by the way. Number 3. Revolutions are not an easy business. The entire season 4 is full of multiple nuggets of wisdom that point out this undeniable truth, namely that revolutions are a messy business, uncontrollable, and once you start it, you have no idea where it leads. We see this both with Smith, who, after all, makes a revolution in the Reich, both with the Nebenwelt project and with the hostile takeover. Yet even though this was supposed to bring him tranquility and the tensions with Berlin that tormented his family and in fact reunite his family, in the end, it doesn't quite work out that way. But this piece of wisdom is displayed even better with the subplot of the BCR, namely the Black Communist Rebellion in the Pacific States. The wisdom is transmitted to them in the speech by the Yakuza boss, who tells them as frank as one could possibly imagine, Look guys, it's easy to take down a government, it's a lot harder to become the government. The Yakuza boss was, of course, correct. The BCR might have succeeded in convincing the Japanese Empire to withdraw from the Pacific states, but now they had to govern. They still needed supply lines, electricity, running water, infrastructure, police, and all the other things necessary to run a society. And no, their anarcho-commie democrat bullshit would have never cut it. In fact, by the end of the show, the de facto leader of the BCR, Belle Mallory, notices that as well when she says, "We wanted a few acres for an autonomous state, now we got a third of North America." Well, yeah, because sometimes that can happen in a revolution. What you want is of a form of marginal relevance at best. Once you start a revolution, you don't exactly control the outcome. Sure, oftentimes you may like the outcome, but you may also end up biting off a lot more than you can chew. Which is exactly what happens to the BCR, who now find themselves in the situation where they have to govern alongside the American resistance, which now includes deserters from the Wehrmacht, and alongside the Yakuza, even though the objectives of the BCR were to create basically an ethno-state. Well, tough luck. But yeah, that's the main wisdom to be drawn from here. Be careful what you wish for. You might get it, and you might not like it. In fact, the point about the revolutionary mentality is made also in the inner workings of the Reich itself. And Smith makes that point too in his pitch to convince Himmler to let him run the invasion of the Pacific states, when he says that, look, America is a rebellious nation. Smith, unlike Himmler, is not just fully aware of the character of America, but also fully aware of the revolutionary character of the Reich itself. And this is made clear both during the flashbacks and the discussions with Bill, his confidant, who eventually ends up being acting Reichsführer of North America himself. So, yeah, basically, be careful with the revolutionary stuff. Number 4. Big organizations are hard to control because people are not machines. This point is made throughout the show, in fact. The first time this point is thoroughly made is when Smith fails to save his son. With all of his influence in the Reich, his son still ends up being subjected to the Reich's policy of euthanizing the crippled. Then comes the situation when he keeps on trying to avoid the tests being made on his middle child. Then comes the situation when his younger child, despite all of his wisdom, ends up belonging to the state, essentially. Well, that must have sucked. But on a more serious note, this is true of any big organization. No matter how awesome and influential you are, or you think you are, in big organizations, change is still slow, and most things that you think should be done, well, can't be done. There's always going to be some zealous, low-ranking fool who insists on sticking to the rules, even if the rules are insane. This point could have been made even better in a season 5. I sure would have loved to see Bill Witchcroft running the autonomous National Socialist America as a committed reformist. But that's a side point. I'll get back to that. And finally, number 5, big regimes take time to change. A lot of people basically complain that the show doesn't have a happy end, but rather an ambiguous one. Well, that's one of the reasons I'm making this video. If the show had a happy end, I would have been sorry for recommending it to anyone to begin with. Why? Because, well, otherwise it would have lacked authenticity. I mean, think about it for a second. The show ends in 1964-ish. So that means the Nazis had about 20 years of rule, give or take, during which they physically removed almost everyone questioning them and created an entire elite and a huge cohort of apparatchiks. This comes with a certain way of doing things, certain reflexes in the populace as a whole. If the show had depicted a revolutionary overnight change in the GNR, the show overall would have sucked badly, because in such a situation you don't get to change things that easy. Even if you are to assume that a significant minority of the population of the GNR is still not exactly fully down with the whole National Socialist project, you don't wipe out 17 or 20 years of peacetime rule during which anyone capable of forming dissident thoughts was long ago sent to a gulag and killed. There are parallels to that in our lifetimes too. I mean, think of the post-communist states. Most of the reflexes formed during the communist era are still there. Sure, not as pronounced now, 30 years later, as they were in, let's say, 1991, but still. Now imagine that in the show you simply wouldn't have the people necessary to populate the apparatus with a post-Nazi elite. You'd have to groom them. Well, also you'd have a huge counter-revolutionary force on your soil that you simply cannot eliminate, namely the kids in all of the Hitler Youth divisions. The show makes it clear that the GNR was doing quite a good job at brainwashing the youth. And as we all know, most revolutions are started by the young. That's why raising children is so important. Every civilization is invaded by violent barbarians all the time, and it's up for that civilization to integrate them really fast. And those barbarians are called children. So, that is why I say that the ambiguous ending makes a lot more sense, because an outright happy end would have been impossible given the rest of the plot. Now, here's why I would have wanted a fifth season. Well, there are a few questions that would have been great. It would have been great to see them explored. For starters, it would have been nice to see how the BCR would govern the Western states. As I said earlier, they had no idea about governance. Belle Mallory, the lady who accidentally ends up leading the BCR, is a wise leader, but very weak in knowledge. Would she even survive as leader? And if yes, how? Because the words of the Yakuza boss were true. There was no way she or the BCR as a whole would rule all by themselves, least of all in a democratic fashion. At the end of the show, we see they have troubles holding San Francisco. How would they hold the newly created Western states? Would they submit to the wisdom of the Yakuza boss and also strengthen their alliance with the American resistance, including the Wehrmacht deserters? Or attempt to rule alone? And if they attempt to rule alone, how would they govern democratically, as their intention is stated? And what if they lose the elections? Which they most certainly would, by the way. Given that they're called communists solely because they were supplied weapons by the Chinese communists at first, would they become communist even more? And if yes, how would that bode with their relationship with the reformed GNR? Because acting Reichsfuhrer Bill Whitcroft called off the aerial bombing of San Francisco and threw away his Iron Cross, but the GNR is still there. Would Reichsfuhrer Bill Whitcroft retain his position? Maybe he would. After all, he was a good military man and he came up with the plan of an independent Nazi America anyway, so he'd likely get the same deal from Gertzmann. But would Bill Whitcroft maintain his tolerance once gulags would go up all over the Western states where anyone disagreeing with the BCR would be sent to? I don't know, but this would have been an interesting question to see explored in a fifth season. Secondly, what happens to the neutral zone? The neutral zone was set up because of the Cold War between the Japanese Empire and the GNR. Two roughly equal powers, sort of, maybe. But now, with the empire withdrawn from the continent, what's the point of the neutral zone anymore? The newly created Western states are not a match for the GNR, so why keep it around? And who would get it? Would acting Reichsfuhrer Bill Whitcroft leave it up for grabs to be integrated into the Western states? Or would he try to integrate the neutral zone peacefully in his reformed GNR? Thirdly, what happens in Tokyo? I mean, the sudden withdrawal surely wasn't really welcomed. We know from our timeline that many Japanese people committed suicide when Japan capitulated at the end of World War II, because they couldn't bear with the shame. In the show, it is also shown that the general who led the invasion of the Pacific states commits suicide when he hears the emperor's announcement. How did this decision affect the hallways of the imperial palace? Are we expected to believe that everyone took this just kindly? That's quite a stretch for a victorious fascist Japan. Fourthly, what happens to all of those who crossed through the Nebenwelt tunnel into the GNR timeline? Sure, it is expected to believe that some of them may end up being agitprop agents, essentially telling people in the GNR that another trade-off is possible, and that the Nazis are not impossible to defeat, and that they don't have to accept this whole totalitarian crap. Sure, but still, what about the rest? Assuming this would all be green-lighted by Reichsfuhrer Bill Whitcroft, how would that bode with the lower rank-and-file apparatchiks? How do you make those accept that? How do you maintain control over those apparatchiks once you don't enforce Reich policy on the non-Aryan people who crossed through the Nebenwelt? Also, how do you maintain the secrecy of the Nebenwelt itself? All of that would have been very interesting to explore, but oh well, it is what it is. So yeah, there's my review of The Man in the High Castle. I'm glad I recommended it before seeing the last 2 seasons, and I hope there will be some spin-off, really, preferably with the future, let's say 1970 Western state. 6 years after the Japanese withdrawal, what comes out of that place? Others have suggested a spin-off with Europe. Now that could be nice too, though I suspect expensive. But still, I'll watch it. So, what do you all think? Have you identified other nuggets of wisdom in the series? Because I know there are others. I only focused on season 4 now, and after all, it's the only reason I do watch certain TV shows from time to time, and it's the main criterion on whether I recommend the show or not. If it doesn't have profound wisdom, then I don't care, which probably explains why I'll never be a dictator. I mean, I just don't like anything that is done solely for the purpose of entertainment. If a piece of art doesn't make you think about profound things, then in my opinion that piece of art belongs into the trash. So, what do you all think? Did you like the ending of The Man in the High Castle? And if not, why not? Do tell me, because this particular alternate universe story is quite fascinating, and who knows, maybe enough buzz is created and we get the spin-off. So yeah, with all of that being said, thank you all for watching. Thank you for your continuous and generous support. Don't forget to subscribe. Send me to the gulag. And I will see you all soon on the Freedom Alternative.